Welcome. My name is Katherine Kelaidis, and I'm the resident scholar here at the National Hellenic Museum. And today I'm very happy to be joined by Annie Liontas, who is the author of this month's book selection. Let me explain you. Annie has been so kind to join us. So we're going to ask her a few questions from me and gathered from all of you out there in the National Hellenic Museum's book club land. So welcome. Thank you so much, Annie.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
This was absolutely a pleasure to read. And I think I shared with you when we spoke last week that the book was sent to me by a friend who said, this is the most sort of authentic portrayal of Greek American life that I've seen. She has the idiom, she has the, and I believe the email said, at the risk of offending, I believe the email said, this lady's really Greek. So, so I guess because we're the National Hellenic Museum and we're interested in telling Greek American stories, if you wouldn't mind kind of starting and telling us sort of the broad shades of your own sort of Greek American story and the ways you think of yourself as very Greek, as my friend called you, or not so much, right?
I love that. I feel like I have like new Greek cred just because of your friend's endorsement or something. She's very Greek. Yeah, I guess when you write a book about the immigrant Greek American experience, people are certainly going to think of you as very Greek. I have always had a kind of torn sense of identity, you know, because of the strong immigrant narrative in my family and the experience. My father's a welder who came to own his own business. You know, so there actually, we knew plenty of people with diners, but we were not that family. But I grew up in diners with friends and Greek people in the community. But really, you know, I do feel like there's the sort of Greek spirit that is very much of the immigrant spirit. And for me, it's very much tied to culture, you know, valuing family, food. Food is clearly, it's a really big thread in this novel. And it's a way that even when you lose other pieces of your culture or even family, you know, living abroad and only getting to go back so many times, food is very, very powerful. You know, it's almost a primitive experience. It's something that we just carried for generations. The foods go back. I mean, we don't even know when was spanakopita made? I don't know. Maybe it existed forever, you know. So for me, food, even as Greek was my first language. So I should just back up and say my parents were in an arranged marriage, and I lived in Greece for the first few years of my life, and then came to the States at you know, like 6 years old. So language I had to kind of relearn as an adult. I had bits and pieces of it, but in order to, you know, communicate with like my aunts and things like that, the theas, I had to like learn again. But food is just, it doesn't need translation really. And, you know, you just kind of carry it with you and you pass it on. So I would say that those are the really big, and music a bit, you know, those are the really big things that stick out for me.
No, absolutely, that makes sense. And I actually want to pick up on what you said about sort of food in the novel and the sort of really central role food played, not just as a sort of, I mean, certainly as a cultural binding agent, and as a sort of binding agent between, I think, characters who are maybe in tension with each other, but also sort of a sensory experience. I was really struck by the extent to which you really picked up on that. And I think that was actually one of the ways, if I may say that, my friend who's also Anna, because #Greeks, right? My sort of, I think, picked up on, and certainly I did, this sense of food, and I think this is true in a lot of cultures, right? But this sense of food as the sort of thing that keeps bringing us back together. I thought that was a really sort of relatable, I mean, for lack of a better word, relatable word. So I guess sort of along those lines about the things that draw us together, one of the things I really enjoyed about the novel was that it sort of penetrated past the sort of idealized view of the Greek family. I think that pervades a lot of American culture, and talked about the stresses of that kind of family and expectations and things. I wonder if you could speak to that, the sort of tension that I think idealized super close family.
Yeah, no, thank you for acknowledging that, because I think that that's a big part of what the book is trying to wrestle with, you know, that we do love the elements of culture that are profound, you know, family, food, but it's not an easy narrative. It's not a simple narrative. And there are a lot of, you know, in Greek culture, a lot of patriarchal forces at work. And so if you're a daughter, if you're a wife, you know, I mean, these things are, they are forces of nature practically in your lives. So it was important to me to like honor and acknowledge every character, including like the patriarch Stavros Mavrakis, who is like, you know, he's a handful. He can like suck all the air out of the room, you know, like, and built very much on many of the Greek men I had known growing up, you know. I mean, I've had a lot of people, a lot of Greek folks, but even like Trinidadian young women say like, I recognize my father in this man, you know. So it is transnational, we'll call it, you know, this force and presence of the patriarch. But it was important. And I actually early on had a very good reader say to me, maybe this is just his book. And I said, no, that's like antithetical to this project, because the women need to have a voice. So I needed to let them speak too. And that I don't think that often happens in popular culture that has to do with Greek texts or Greek families or Greek narratives. I don't think that happens as much as I'd like to see, but it was important to me to give all of them, you know, in their messy lives, some space, you know.
I think that was what was, I think, really beautiful for me. I think particularly, and one of the things I think, you know, I struggle with as sort of a scholar of the Greek American experience at some level, is that our community, and I'm going to include you, whether you want to be included or not, but like, I think our community struggles to tell not just the story outside of the story of the patriarch, the sort of very clear narrative of the Greek man comes to America, makes good, which is a true story at some level, but but also the story of people who maybe don't fit, right? Don't fit the narrative, right? And you really gave space to that in this novel, and gave women who maybe aren't able to sort of play out those roles of the good wife and daughter well. And I wonder if you wanted to, I mean, you've spoken really eloquently about it now.
Sure.
Sort of,
no, yeah. I love talking about the daughters. So I, you know, they're the heart, in some ways, really the heart of the project for me. I mean, I'm a queer Greek American, you know, and that narrative just does not exist in the stories we tell ourselves in Greek families. And you know, and even Litsa, the character, who is just struggling to kind of like normalize, I think, in the way that a Greek parent or a Greek family might think of it. There's not really room for that kind of person either. Really, you know, like there is a strong narrative of obedience and kind of assuming the family narrative, which I don't know. I think it doesn't come from a place of malice, but it's really all tied up in honor, right? Like there are these questions, big questions of honor, and so what I needed to do in this book is write the people who aren't always seen. And so, you know, one of my main characters, Stavrula, is gay, and you know, struggling with that in the role of her family, and even just in possessing it in her own life, which is not really my story is not Stavrula's story, but I was very sympathetic to a young Greek woman who would have that struggle, you know, and in some ways is like perfect in her father's eyes. You know, it's just like this one thing. Can you just change this one thing? And she's like, no, this is who I am. So I that was important to me too, to just acknowledge and give them like full life, you know, these women who are not always well behaved in the eyes of their families, you know?
I think first, I think one of the, just, you know, really quickly, I think one of the things that was so powerful is having sort of an explicitly queer narrative in a piece of Greek American fiction or in Greek fiction. I think that's changed a little bit more in the fiction that's coming out of Greece. But I think it's so important because we are, I think like a lot of immigrant communities, maybe if I can be so bold, we try so hard to control the narrative of our, you know, the sort of outward projected narrative. Right. And I think that's really damaging at some level. Which leads me to a question that I wasn't going to ask, but I'm going to ask you.
Sure.
Because you brought up the sort of transnational patriarchs. In these sort of conversations around toxic masculinity and, you know, this conversations about, I think, masculinity in general that we're having, I think are a huge part of the conversations around, you know, gender and race even that are happening in this country. One of the things that I think that's been difficult for me personally, if I could just speak to my own experience, is that there was a lot of toxic masculinity in the culture we grew up in, but there were also a lot of, you know, sympathetic patriarchs, right? I have a very complicated relationship with that kind of overbearing masculinity. And one of the things in the book that really attracted me is that you give that space as well. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of how maybe the sort of normative experience of masculinity and sort of toxic masculinity in Greek culture, but I think in a lot of these sort of more traditional patriarchal cultures, how that plays into this sort of mainstream narrative that's happening. That question may not make sense, but if it does.
I think I get it. If you don't mind, Kate, if you could just tilt your screen a little bit, just because I'm catching the perfect. Just a little bit more, if you don't mind. Yeah, perfect. Okay. You know, so that's fine. I think the question of masculinity in Greek culture, it's a really complicated one, right? I think it grows out of this impulse and this mythology around what it means to take care of your family and protect your family. And so there were plenty of, let's say, like sympathetic or caring Greek men that I might encounter, you know, as a young woman growing up in the community. And I would say those caring men still had expressions of toxic masculinity, especially when they were, you know, gathering. It was like men with men, and the women were barely seen. I mean, women or children were barely seen in the room. So I guess I don't think that anybody, when it's so culturally pervasive, I don't think anybody really escapes it. And until we start to ask the question of what is its role, like why evolutionarily have we held on to it, you know, and what is it, you know, why is it so important? And then how do we question that? How do we critique it? And how do we kind of move away from that, right? How do we say you can be a man and protective and strip the other kinds of emphases on masculinity, right? Like those they're not necessarily entangled. We've just kind of we've allowed for that to happen, or we've been culpable in that. But yeah, I think I don't think anybody gets out unscathed because it's so pervasive and a bit unquestioned. I mean, starting to question it, but I think it's going to take longer for immigrant communities because of the reasons you've already, you know, they're sort of really the binding agent in immigrant communities is so powerful that it's hard to start to ask those questions. You know, I mean, queer participation in popular culture in America looks very different than the way it might look in like a Greek community. So I think it's part of that same spectrum.
Absolutely, and I think that makes perfect sense. And I think it goes to sort of, I think part of what is going on as well is this sort of what I call like an immigrant generation gap, right? In families, generally, there's a sort of generation gap. I feel like in immigrant families, that is an even bigger chasm a lot of the time. And I speak to that in a really powerful way. Like, how do you, even in the idiom of the book, and if you want to talk about this, I'd be interested, like, even in the idiom of the book, the reality is when you're speaking to your immigrant relatives, frequently you're not speaking in the same language.
Oh, I think that's exactly the right way to put it. It is, the language is very different, even when you're, you know, even when the common language is English or Greek or whatever it is, but I think that's absolutely true. I tell the story in the book about the father, Stavros, getting frustrated one day and saying to the girls, do you want me to smell my fingers, right? Which is an idiom that comes to us from ancient Greece, when people would dip their finger, like the sort of seers would dip their fingers in oil and smell them and be able to predict who was going to win the Olympics, right? So that's like something, and Stavros doesn't even know that probably, right? So that's been handed down, and he's trying to use it in a way that, the colloquial English expression would be, do you think I'm a mind reader? But the language is so, it does not, there is no you can do it word for word, the verbatim does not translate the impulse. And I love that as an illustration, because I think any reader, it's a bit of an artifact in a book, any reader can pick that up and kind of laugh at it. And we're not laughing at Stavros, we're laughing at the dissonance between the two. Like, they're never going to communicate, this does not compute. And so that for me was like a very, as writers look for these little portholes to help express these kinds of, visceral or emotional experiences. This experience really, that is, you don't get me, I'll never get you. I don't know what you've been through. You can't understand what it's like me to straddle these two identities, and that's really, it's a quick way to kind of nod to that. But yeah, I think that there are, that gap is so big because the experiences are so divergent for both parties,
Well, I think, and along those lines, and that's absolutely it. It's this sort of, you're just from a different planet, right? I sometimes would experience this with my grandparents. It's like they might as well have come in from Mars, right?
Totally. Mm-hmm. Yep.
I think part of that is, and I've seen reviewers call it the magical realism in your book. That sort of sense of the mystical that pervades. At first, it felt very sort of Greek. But I wonder if you'd like to talk about that, because I think it's something that Greek culture shares with a lot of these sort of traditional cultures. Certainly, magical realism as a South American and Latin American genre is really important. But I'd be interested in sort of both sort of your desire to place that in the book, where that comes from, but also the sort of, I guess, technical mechanics of that as well. So it's kind of a two-part question.
Sure, yeah. I do love magical realism. It really does speak to me, particularly in the tradition of like Gabriel Garcia Marquez or Salman Rushdie, so I think something has always kind of appealed to me and made sense as a way of like allowing a reader to understand and maybe ununderstandable reality, and that's been, and I think that's speaking to the question you just asked about, this inability to communicate or translate, like that's in some ways how the magical realism does work in the book. And sometimes it's like the larger gestures, but sometimes it's even like, there's a scene where Stavrula and her mentor Marina are carving up a whole pig. And that's something, it's something that people do as a job, or, and it's something that in the real world, as people, if you eat meat, you don't often think about like this as part of a whole, but just the scene where you have to kind of walk through it with them it's an opportunity to, see the things that are so often unseen. And so that was true of Stavros's history, even the goat of death, which is just a kind of, for me, that's just a very fun, weird, like strange artifact in the book that came out of, I will say, just kind of came out of nowhere. Like, I don't know where the goat came from. It just sort of felt right as an agent. This is some of the I'm lucky enough as a writer to, some stuff is just, it's as mysterious to me as it is as mysterious to the reader. But yeah, I feel like the magical realism in that way is a way to bridge this gap a little bit. And sort of like the idioms to help the reader and to help me understand, like, what are these experiences or phenomenon.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think, like, there's also almost something kind of Bulgakov-esque to me with the goat of death, and really that. And also, I guess maybe sort of along those lines of things that are unseen, the ways in which you sort of delve into Stavros' past and you sort of explore his own, I think maybe, once again, this idea of people's, especially immigrants, pasts and childhoods and experiences as hidden. I think that was really powerful. And the stories the scene in the diner with the Galactiburiko, for example, was really powerful. Was that desire to sort of illustrate his past, was that something maybe that came, not to sort of, I know death of the author, but was that something that kind of came from your own desire to sort of, I guess, excavate the people in your own family? Or I guess there's a real sensitivity there that I'd like to kind of.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. So, I mean, in my research for the book, I came across this term that I hadn't known before, Zenisha, right? Like from Xenos. And it's this experience of the immigrant really just a feeling of some kind of profound estrangement. And I found it so like haunting and beautiful. And one of those experiences that if you're not in it, if you haven't had it yourself, rebuilding your life as an adult, let's say, in a new country, it's very hard to understand how someone can be the way they are, right? And so Stavros and other immigrants like him, it's interesting, you like go back to Greece or you go back to your home country and you're like, wow, why are these people like chiller than my dad, And in some way that feeling of estrangement makes you like hold on really tight to what you've lost because you'll never get it back, And that's the experience of the immigrant in part, I think. And so I knew that there were things about Stavros I didn't understand, I would never understand. And as a writer, your characters are always going to be just like regular people. There are things about them you won't ever know or understand, but you have to try, And food was such a strong entry point for me and for the entire novel that it felt right for Stavros. And there's a scene in Proust where he talks about eating the Madeleine and all these memories and all this experience really, it's a psychological experience, the experience of eating this cookie, the Madeleine. And so I sort of borrowed for that and I wanted to understand like what are the secrets of his own emotional history that Stavros keeps. And his secrets are all tenderness, this experience of like biting into Galactiburiko and remembering his mother in a way that he never even knew he remembered. And that was about getting to his humanity, So it was a way to connect with someone who feels so unreachable. And it still is unreachable, but at least I can see this one small experience in his life.
And actually, just as you were speaking, this was not a planned question, but just as you were speaking, I was thinking about this, that the ways that relates back, I think, to the way we relate to patriarchs, right? That what you just said, what he was hiding was his tenderness.
Right.
I was, just as you said, I was thinking about, when my grandfather died and we were sort of cleaning out, my grandmother had died 20 years before, quite young, but we were cleaning out his things. And there was this letter she had written him, when they were, 16 years old, kind of chastising him for not calling her when he went out. Like he'd come to the town she was living in and not like let him know she was there. And, he had held on to that for 60 years. And if you met him, you would never have thought he was, I imagine you're similar character,
Yeah.
It would not have come that way. This idea that they're hiding their tenderness, and there's this, particularly from, I think it's as a daughter, as a woman in this culture, that's a really kind of painful experience in some ways, right? This sort of love for you that's behind this mask. I think you did a sort of excellent job. The flowers, for example, at the beginning of the book, when he brings, Carol the flowers, I think that's a really powerful sort of acknowledgement of the damage that kind of patriarchy does to men. If you wanted to comment on that, I'd actually be really interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it makes me think a bit of what we were talking about earlier with toxic masculinity. And, the range of human experience is so complex, right? And so if women aren't allowed to feel anger, if men aren't allowed to feel tenderness, we shrink people, they don't become the full expression of what they can be. And when you limit that, you really you can wall people, you know, people get walled off. I'm talking about the kind of like big cultural forces that shape how we think, right? And so if you're a young man, if you're a young Greek man who has been convinced that you're not allowed to feel hurt, pain, sadness, tenderness, you know, it's going to kind of cut you off, you know, it'll create a kind of gnarled experience. I'm not saying that in a judgmental way. I'm just saying in a way that's sad. You know, it's sad that we have not yet been able to encourage that full breadth of experience because it's human. You know, it's like deeply human.
And I think maybe, I mean, one of the things I walked away from the book with was this really deep understanding of the ways in which we all end up cutting off parts of ourselves to make these narratives that our culture gives us, not just Greek, those
sure.
The way we all end up cutting up to make those narratives work, and what happens when people release the valve and the real damage that does, right? Because people haven't been wrestling with that. And I think that's a really important contribution I think the book makes, maybe to our community. I think one of the reasons I'm really anxious, I was really anxious to make it one of our book club selections, is I think good for us as a community to talk about those things. So thank you very, very much for doing that, because us having those conversations as a community requires people being brave enough to raise the issue, to raise the point, in the words of the British Parliament. And you sort of did that, and you did do that, and I really appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate your acknowledgement of it. And I think, you know, there are, when we were talking about tenderness, and specifically with Stavros, you know, there's something that occurs to me, which is there's a woman that he has not let himself be seen or known by most people, right? And even his writer. But there's a woman that he genuinely loves, but she's a Black woman, and he cannot let himself be with her, even though we all sort of in tune, like, wait, but you might actually be happy like this, you know, and he cannot do it. And so if there's anything that I want to do with this book, it's to just maybe give a reflection or permission to say, like, there are all these various expressions of our existence, whether we're immigrants or American or whatever, that are not part of a dominant narrative, but that maybe even more so deserve to live.
That's beautiful. I will end actually with the way we end our oral histories, and I'm going to invite you, if at some point you have the time, to give us an oral history, because the National Hellenic Museum has the largest collection of Greek American oral histories in the world. And one of the things we're working on is diversifying the stories that are told in those oral histories. So if you have time at some point, we would love to get you to come give us an oral history. Or so when, as my goddaughter calls it, the sickness passes. The sickness? No, not the sickness. But I'll end with the question, if you don't mind. That was actually a really beautiful way to end, so maybe I shouldn't ruin it. But I'll end with the question we ask people at the end of their oral histories, which is, what does your Greek identity mean to you?
I think it's something subterranean, and it means strength, resilience, and a kind of knowing how to survive. That's what it's really given me. That's
beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you for spending today.
This was wonderful.
This was absolutely great. Thank you so much.